Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we are going to be talking about the third and final exposure control, shutter speed. And we're going to talk about some of the really cool things that you can do with shutter speed when it comes to action. So before we jump in though, I want to do a quick review of shutter and shutter speed as it relates to exposure. If you remember from a previous video that we did, we talked about how the shutter is the door through which light passes on your camera. The door opens, light floods through and exposes the sensor in the back of your camera. We also talked about shutter speed, and shutter speed is, basically how long or how short that door is open. The longer it's open, the more light's flooding through and the brighter your image is going to be. The quicker it's open, the less light that's going to pass through your camera and expose the sensor. So you're going to have a dimmer shot, depending, of course, on your aperture and ISO and some other factors. But I think you get the concept. With that said now, let's jump into some of the really cool creative things that you can do with shutter speed. And the really cool thing that you can do is basically freeze or blur action. Now, the amount of blur, or whether or not your shot is frozen or you get that blur, is going to depend on a couple of things. One, it's going to depend on how fast is your subject moving, and second, it's going to depend on the shutter speed that you choose. So let's jump over to this slide and I'll illustrate sort of what it is I'm talking about. All right, so here we have a picture of a woman passing through an arch, and you'll notice that the woman is blurry. There's some motion blur going on. So let's break down what exactly is going on here in this picture. So first of all, the photographer sets up their camera and releases the shutter. The shutter opens, the subject passes through the scene, and then the shutter closes. So how do you know if this woman is really, whipping through the shot on her way in a big hurry to some, important event, or is she just taking a leisurely pace? Like I said before, that it depends. It depends on the speed of the subject, and it depends on the shutter speed that's used. Let me illustrate. So let's say you're going to take a picture of me, and we're going to use, let's say, 3 seconds, a 3-second exposure. So we go ahead, I say here, the shutter opens, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, and it closes. How much blur are you going to have in this shot of me? Well, probably not much at all, except for my mouth moving. But I didn't really move. I sat here still for 3 seconds. So there's not going to be much blur. Let's try it again. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Okay, the shutter this time was open for 3 seconds. So I moved from here to right about here. I'm going to have that much motion blur whenever you look at the shot after you've taken it. So there's going to be a streak of my head moving across the frame. Let's try it again. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. All right, that time I moved quite a bit in the frame during that time that the shutter was open. So I'm going to have a streak of blur from here to here going across the camera, with some blur also on my shirt moving from here to here. So I'm going to have this kind of arch effect. Now let's try it with a different shutter speed. Let's say we open at 1/60th of a second, or let's go even more extreme. Let's go 1/500th of a second. So I sit still and the shutter opens. Done. I didn't move at all. Well, I didn't move at all, and that was open for such a small fraction of a second that it's not going to show any movement. Let's say I'm going like this. I just took 2 shots, and they're again going to be frozen because I was moving so little in that fraction of a second, even though in the time that you're watching the video, I'm moving quite a bit. But in the time that shutter was open, it was just a small fraction of a second. And so how much did I move in 1/500th of a second? Not very much. So I'm going to have a shot of me here and another one of me here frozen. Now, let's say I'm even going like this, going crazy, 1/500th of a second. Still, even though I'm moving like crazy, the second that shutter opens for 1/500th of a second, I barely move during that time frame. And so I'm frozen in space. Well, not in space, against this white background. So anyway, I hope you get the idea of why it is that shutter speed and the amount of blur that you create in your photograph is going to be impacted by how fast the subject is moving and by how long that shutter is open for. So let's take a look at some creative things then that you can do with these concepts. So here we've got 3 shots that illustrate sort of what you can do with shutter speed. And we're going to take a minute and break down each of these and see if we can determine what shutter speed was used. So in the first shot, we have a shot of the city at night with some lights flowing through on the freeway. Those lights, of course, are the taillights and the headlights of cars. Now, how long do you think this was open for? The way you can figure that out is think about, well, this looks like it's probably a freeway or something like that. And so the cars are going fairly quickly, and you're not seeing any detail in the car. So they're traveling pretty far during this shot. So to go from the foreground all the way to the background, I'm going to guess it could be anywhere from 1 minute to maybe 2 minutes that shutter is open for those cars to travel that distance. In the second shot, we've got clouds blasting through the sky. It looks like there's a tornado going on or something like that. The reality is those clouds are moving probably pretty slow if you look at the weather patterns there. So my guess is that, it could have been open for anywhere from 2 to 5 to 10 minutes to get that exposure. And then in the last shot, the explosion of those fireworks, well, when something explodes, it fires off pretty rapidly. So I'm going to guess on that exposure to get the streak of light, the distance that you've got them there, maybe a 1/4 of a second to an 1/8 of a second to maybe a 1/15 of a second. The only way to know really for sure is to go out and experiment. But I think that gives us a pretty good guess because you understand how fast the object moves in the frame, and then you can make a guess as to how long that shutter was open for. Let's take a look at some more examples here. So on the left here, we have a woman standing at the subway. Now, is that train coming to a stop or is it whipping right past her? Kind of looks like it's whipping right past her. But again, it depends. It depends on the shutter speed that's used, and it depends on the speed of the object. If the train were moving slowly and we had a long shutter speed, we could get that effect. Or if it's moving really quick and we had a little bit of a faster shutter speed, we could get the exact same effect. Same with the image in the middle. Again, depends on how fast they're moving and how long it's open. And with the image on the right of the pool balls. If those were just hit and slamming into each other, then we could probably use a faster shutter speed and get the same effect. If the balls had been bouncing around for a while and this was the final stop, we're going to need a much slower shutter speed. I hope this gives you some ideas of some things that you can do. A lot of times as I've taught these classes, we talk about shutter speed. We give the challenge to go out and shoot something. What do we get? We get pictures of flags. We get pictures of fans. We get pictures of a dog running in the backyard and a lot of grass. And I want to encourage you as you're out shooting the assignment, be creative. Try to think beyond the obvious, the fan that just happens to be moving above your head, and try to think beyond the easy, because generally that's what's happened. It's just like, well, I got to do this assignment, so I'll photograph that thing that's moving right there. Be creative. Have fun with the assignment. Up to this point, we've talked about, or the illustrations that I've shown you, we have looked at instances where the camera is fixed and the subject is moving. Let's take a look at some other really cool things that you can do. So in this shot, it's kind of the inverse of that. The camera is moving, but the subject is fixed. The subject being the bicycle. So the photographer has somehow mounted the camera to his or her body or the bike and is cruising down this trail. So the shutter opens, as you can see here, the camera moves, and then the shutter closes. Well, the handlebars didn't really move hardly at all in that shot, but the scene around is flying by. So something really cool that you can try, and I'd encourage you to go out and try this, maybe, with a car or whatever. All right, so hopefully this gives you some ideas of some things that you can do when it comes to blurring action. Now let's take a look at what you can do when it comes to freezing action. And you know what? Concept is the same as what we've talked about so far. So here we have a shot of a surfer, surfing a wave that's crashing. And, the same things happen that's happened in all the other shots. The shutter opens, the subject moves, the shutter closes. But the time that that shutter is open is so minuscule, potentially 1/8,000th of a second. How much movement occurs in 1/8,000th of a second? Very, very little. Even though that surfer could be really whipping around that wave, the time that shutter is open is so minimal, it freezes everything. Let's take a look at some other examples of frozen action. So here we have a shot of a helicopter that looks like it's going to fall out of the sky. The propellers aren't moving. Well, it's because how fast do those propellers move? They move ridiculously fast. How much distance do they travel, however, in 1/8,000th of a second or more? Not very much. And so we capture the propellers holding virtually still. I'm sure if you zoomed in, you'd see a very little bit of motion blur on those propellers. Same thing with the shots of the soccer players. Again, 1/5,000, 1/4,000, 1/1000th of a second. Even though they're whipping by, that shutter is open for so little that the distance they travel is virtually non-existent. And the same in the guys in the end doing the parkour. So now we're going to sort of merge the two together, freezing action and blurring action, with a technique that's called panning. So let's take a look at what this technique does. So here we have a shot of a guy on a motorcycle that is just whipping by, and yet the motorcycle and the motorcyclist are frozen. I mean, they're sharp. There's no blur to them, but the blur is all in the background. So what's happened here is the shutter is open and both the camera and the subject are moving at the same speed, and then the shutter closes. Now, you don't necessarily have to be on a car driving next to the motorcycle. You could also be standing still and sort of like if you've ever gone out and shot clay pigeons, the clay pigeon fires off, you follow it, you shoot, and then you continue to follow it. So you don't, whenever you're shooting clay pigeons, you don't follow it, shoot, and stop. You got to follow, shoot, and continue to follow. Same thing with the panning technique. Your object's moving, you're following it, you release the shutter, and you continue to follow. The key is making sure that you are moving your camera at the exact same speed as that subject. So whether that means you're on a car, which probably is the case in this shot of the motorcyclist, or whether that means that you're standing on the side following it like somebody who's shooting clay pigeons. So that's panning. So this last series of image, we have examples of what happens when you shoot with a slow shutter speed, moving camera, and a moving subject. Now, the first time you look at these shots here, these final shots, you may look at them and say, whoa, they should have slapped that thing on a tripod. But I want you to stop and kind of, refrain from those judgments and look at them and ask yourself, what do I feel when I look at these photographs? Are you feeling uneasy? Do you feel uncomfortable? Do you feel a sense of energy radiating out of these shots? It's important as we move on through the course that you start asking yourself those questions. What emotion does this technique evoke? Because once you understand that, then you can start to pre-visualize. You can say, you know what, I want to create a shot that emanates to the viewer a sense of stillness or quiet. All right, so what are you going to use? What techniques are you going to use? Are you going to use a shaky camera, slow shutter speed, and moving subject? Probably not. If looking at these shots you say, whoa, that's a sense of energy, then probably not. But maybe if we go back to the shot that we looked at of the woman standing by the subway, whipping by, maybe that contrast there of fast with slow emphasizes stillness. So ask yourself those questions. As you begin to look at photographs and you examine them, say, what emotion am I getting from this photograph? What techniques are they employing? What have they done here? And now how can I leverage that to create that same emotion when I want to do that with my photographs? Once you start to do that, you're on the road to becoming a great photographer. With that said, now let's go ahead and jump into the shutter speed assignment and go through what you're going to be working on here moving forward over the next hours or days or however long it takes you to shoot this. All right, so here we are over in the assignment. To review, the speed of your shutter in relation to the speed your subject is moving is the primary factor to controlling the amount of motion blur in your final photograph. Generally speaking, a faster shutter speed will freeze motion and a slower shutter speed will blur motion. In this assignment, you are going to explore both ends of the spectrum. You are going to freeze action and you're going to blur action. Be sure to photograph subjects under several different lighting conditions. The brightness of the light will impact your ability to freeze and to blur motion. In other words, you need to shoot outside, bright light, midday, and then maybe sunrise, sunset, at night where everything is illuminated with street lamps, inside with the fluorescence, incandescent lights. Play with the whole range so that you have a lot of different shutter speeds available to you. If you only shoot outside, you're going to be limited in what shutter speed you can shoot at. Here's what you're going to master: the use of shutter speeds to Let's try that again. The use of shutter speeds to blur and freeze motion. And here's what you're going to do. So first, you're going to find a subject or object that is interesting to you. And actually, you know what? I would encourage you, before you actually go out and shoot, pre-visualize. Think about, what do I want to photograph? Maybe look at some photographs, thumb through some magazines, look on the internet, whatever. See if you can find some ideas, and then think. I want to make this shot. I've got this idea in my head that's been inspired from this other image that I saw. I want to create it. Okay, go do it now. Use the techniques you've used with shutter speed to go do it. Pre-visualize. All right, so you're going to find a subject or object that is interesting to you. You're going to then attempt to freeze the subject or object using the fastest shutter speed possible while maintaining a good exposure. Remember, if you select a shutter speed but can't open or close your aperture enough to get a good exposure, you have to change your shutter speed and then try again. I'll show you an example over in the camera sim in just a second. Next, keeping the same composition, you're going to attempt to blur the shutter or blur the subject or object using the slowest shutter speed possible while maintaining a good exposure. Again, remember, if you select a shutter speed but you can't open or close your aperture enough to get a good exposure, change your shutter speed and try again. And then last of all, keeping the same composition, photograph the subject or object using a shutter speed somewhere in between the last two while maintaining a good exposure. And then you're going to repeat that with different subjects, objects, lighting conditions. So basically, you are going to walk away, just like in the aperture assignment, with 3 identical shots. The only difference between the 3 is that your subject is going to be varying degrees of blurry or frozen action. So that's what you're going to be doing. That said, let's jump over to the camera sim. Let me show you what I'm talking about. All right, so here we are now over in the camera sim. You can see by default my exposure is started off at ISO 400, f11 at 1/60th of a second. Well, first thing I want to do is freeze action. That windmill is moving fairly quickly. So to freeze action, I'm going to need the fastest shutter speed possible. I'm going to dial this all the way up to 1/4000th of a second, because I'm pretty sure that's going to freeze action. All right, so let's go ahead and adjust our aperture to get that in the middle. And I am trying to open it. I've got 0.004 of a second. I went all the way down to 2.8, and I'm still not quite in the middle. So I just go ahead and shoot it, right? Wrong. Remember what you need to do. If the shutter speed and aperture combination don't let you get the right exposure, I'm going to need to make a little tweak to my shutter speed. So I'm going to dial that down. Let's try 1/2000th of a second. We'll go one stop darker, or brighter, I mean. And we'll leave it there at 2.8. Sweet, I got it. 1/2000th at 2.8. So we'll go ahead and snap the photo. And there we go. Perfect. Look at that. Nice and sharp. I froze action. Now, we'll go back here, and there was one thing that I could have done. I was at 0.004 of a second, f2.8. Remember, I can always adjust the ISO. So let's play with that and see what we get. So I could have taken it up to 800 ISO, aperture 3.5, 1/4000th of a second, And, that's looking pretty good. The only problem is ISO 800 is going to be a bit grainy. Do I want the grain or do I want the action? My choice. All right, so now we're going to try to blur action. So let's go the slowest shutter speed possible. I'm going to take it to 1 second. Okay, and then we'll dial our aperture. Uh-oh, running into problems again. I'm still overexposed by more than 2 stops at f22, 1 second. All right, well, let's see if I can adjust my ISO. I'll take it down to 100. Still not doing it. Okay, so my option then is I've got to take my shutter speed and I've got to make adjustments here. So it looks like I can go as slow as 1/8 of a second, and that's maxed out, the slowest possible shutter speed. Snap our photo, and there we go. Blurred action. Now I'm looking at this thinking, wow, that's not just blurred action. I've blurred everything. This is going back to that example of camera is moving, subject is moving, and a slow shutter speed. This is not going to serve you for the assignment. If you're doing a shot like this, that needs to be locked down on the tripod, unless you are intentionally for 1 or 2 shots experimenting with the moving camera, moving subject, and slow shutter speed. But for most of the shots, you're not going to see the effect if you don't lock it down on a tripod. So remember to do that. Lock it down on a tripod if it goes below the minimum handheld shutter speed. Okay. All right, so let's jump back over here. Go back to the camera. And this time I'm going to try with something in between. So I started with I think I got up to 4,000th, all the way down to 1/8. Let's go somewhere in between, so maybe 1/200th of a second, and we'll adjust our aperture. There we go. And snap the photo. All right. So now I have 3 shots that are identical that all show me what happens at different shutter speeds. I can then use that as a tool to say, okay, well, I get the idea that this subject is moving at about the same pace as this girl. So if I shoot at 1/8 of a second, I'm going to get a decent amount of blur. If I want to freeze it, I probably need to go up to 1,000th or 2,000 or 4,000. All right, let's jump back over to the assignment now. The last thing that I want you to do is to reflect, just like in all other assignments. So looking at your images, why did some that you attempted to freeze end up blurring and vice versa? What would you need to do next time to achieve the desired result? More light, less light, different shutter speed? And then last of all, select 3 frames, 3 of your favorite images. And why did you like those as opposed to the identical images you shot using a different shutter speed? This is where we get into the emotional experience that's created by your photographs. Which images did you like the best? Well, you probably liked them because there was something about them that made you feel something. So look at it, reflect over that. What was it that happened? What worked? Last thing here in the assignment, there is of course an exposure log. Make sure you write down the description of the subject you're photographing, the aperture you use, the shutter speed you use, and then write down again, were you attempting to blur or freeze? Again, don't do this after you release the shutter. Don't release the shutter and say, oh yeah, freezing that one. No, say, I am going to freeze this shot. Snap the picture and then see if you were successful. All right, I think that's it on the assignment. Hopefully this has given you some really great ideas that you can play with as you're out there experimenting with shutter speed and with motion blur and with freezing action. So go out, have a lot of fun on this assignment, and we'll see you in the next lesson.